tanky. And it's funny how the term tanky has become so mainstream that the New York Times has used this term. Originally, of course, tanky goes back to 1956 when there were splits in the Communist Party over people who had said that obviously it was a counter-revolution happening in Hungary backed by Western intelligence. We now have evidence showing that that analysis is correct historically, whereas the people who opposed the operation, the Soviet military intervention, Hungary was not part of the Soviet Union, but Hungary was part of the Warsaw Pact. People who opposed that said that the others were tankies, right? So it refers to this particular historical moment. And now it's just become such a bastardized term that it basically means anyone who criticizes U.S. foreign policy is a tanky, including they call Noam Chomsky a tanky, even though Noam Chomsky was himself one of the most vicious critics of the Soviet Union throughout the first Cold War. And I should just also add that it's so funny because people will say, what is a tanky? And other people will say, it's a Stalinist. But it was actually not Joseph Stalin. It was Khrushchev, the anti-Stalin figure. Like he oversaw the process of de-Stalinization. It was the Khrushchev government that oversaw the intervention in Hungary. So anyway, I mean, this history, ironically, even though it's so little understood, there's very little known about it. It's become this kind of very influential historical moment in terms of today's political culture because it gives rise to this ridiculous political slur that has become so prominent that pundits at the Washington Post and the New York Times and Bloomberg constantly use it.
Yeah, that's a very interesting phenomenon and something that I've thought about recently, and it just seems kind of comical to me. If you recall, recently Kit Clarenberg wrote a story about where they had these emails from Paul Mason, who'd been working with some British spooks to basically go after anti-war outlets, like Grey Zone and so on. And they, at some point in the exchange of emails, they say, we really want to make sure that an anti-imperialist identity doesn't emerge. And so I think that that's instructive when you want to understand why all of a sudden are outlets like the New York Times and people who pretend to be serious commentators, your various imperial PR flacks in the U.S. establishment, why are they saying tanky? Like they're using sort of a juvenile, catty sort of insult that is that's not really appropriate for this social setting, right? They're supposed to be serious people, not people who are bullying other kids, other junior high kids on social media. It's why are they calling people tankies? And I think really what it comes down to is you say tanky because the anti-imperialist identity is what they really are. They will need to disparage this. They need to name it and other it to people. And so they don't mind, they don't mind seeming sort of unserious, kind of bitchy, petty people by saying tanky, because they don't want to actually say these are anti-imperialists, because this is really the heart of the whole project that they're upholding. And so they even naming what this is anathema to them. Now, as far as the irony,
I'm sorry to cut you off really quickly. I mean, I know you are going to have a more serious discussion of the history of the Eisenhower administration and the CIA, but just while we're on this subject, I mean, the way tanky is discussed is clearly it means a leftist who's anti-imperialist, who's against U.S. imperialism, because here's this is a funny thing that went viral on Twitter with it got ratioed, and it's this anarchist saying, what I hope when people say they're a communist, and it's all of these white European or U.S. anarchists, well, excluding Rosa Luxemburg and Marx, they just throw in there, like Kropotkin, who was himself a prince, like a feudal royal in the Russian monarchy. I also have Murray Bookchin, who supported Zionism and U.S. imperialism. They have Bakunin, who ironically was a hardcore anti-Semite. They have David Graeber, who supported the U.S. military occupation of Syria. And then they say what they mean in reality, and they're talking about, and then the tweet they wrote F tankies, and then what they mean in reality. And they have Thomas Sankara from Burkina Faso. They have Che Guevara. They have Kim from DPRK. They have Xi Jinping. And then, of course, they have Stalin. They also have Engels, which is funny. They for some reason, they think Marx is different from Engels. Anyway, whatever. These people are dumb. But what this really shows to me is tanky means specifically an anti-imperialist socialist, and specifically one in the global south. If you're in the global south and you oppose U.S. imperialism, you're a tanker. That's what it's come to mean. I just wanted to point that out because there's a key, also just like a racist element in this today. If you're a black or brown socialist in the global south, you're a tanker by definition.
Right. I mean, these are, I feel like this is an online thing that is very suspicious in terms of like who would actually be supporting this. I mean, I think it's not literally true that like, oh yeah, these people have to be all feds, but I think that probably the origin of this becoming like a current of thought that you see on Twitter is not a natural thing, because if you're a leftist and you're a person who's like actually holds sort of leftist emancipatory political ideas, you're not going to be fixating on the enemies of the most powerful and wealthy capitalist empire in history. It just doesn't make any sense. So I'm very suspicious of that. But the actual, getting back to the tanky term, it reemerges from, it has its origins in the 50s and it relates to that Hungary uprising where they sent in the tanks. But this is another case where it's a CIA covert operation to back these elements in Hungary, and this was overseen by, as I understand it, Frank Wisner, and he was really racked with guilt after the CIA and the U.S. did not intervene in this country, because that would have meant World War III. And so, wiser people prevailed, but they did destabilize the country enough to provoke a response. And they as a result, this uprising gets crushed, and then the U.S. just sort of makes good propaganda out of that and says, look how brutal the Soviets are. But the U.S. wouldn't tolerate Russian destabilization of their near abroad. Like look at the Cuban Missile Crisis. And for Frank Wisner himself, this led to his suicide. But it wasn't just that. He also was Frank Wisner is. I have pictures of Frank Wisner. And he was one of the top guys. He was the guy that was running essentially the dirty tricks department of the CIA initially, which was the Office of Policy Coordination. And he was overseeing this big operation, the Outer Islands Rebellion. And I don't know that he was exactly informed that it was meant to fail after a certain point. It was, so he again is sort of hung out to dry here. It was the second biggest CIA operation, the one in Indonesia, by Frank Wisner, the guy that had, been behind the Hungary uprising, which later gave rise to the tanky meme when the Soviets intervened to predictably crush it. Okay, but here he's part of the CIA operation in Indonesia following this, which was the second biggest covert operation besides what they were doing in Vietnam. I mean, let's say CIA operation, because they had huge operations in Vietnam. Only this one was close in terms of its size. There were small arms and warships, submarines, air support. And this is the Dulles foreign policy, the Dulles brothers of Sullivan and Cromwell, and then the State Department and CIA under Eisenhower. This is their policy for Indonesia. Although it's questionable as to how much John Foster even really understood Alan Dulles' long game on this. Greg Polgrain has an interesting material on this, but I think Alan Dulles was really operating on a different plane than John Foster Dulles, who was more of a concrete thinker and a Christian fundamentalist, but also, dedicated U.S. imperialist and Sullivan Cromwell partner. Now, the way that this all fails is you have some debacles on the U.S. side. 2 bombers explode. You have the capture of a main weapon drop, and in a way, you needed this whole thing to fail. Dulles needed the Outer Islands Rebellion to ultimately fail, and that it needed to be perceived as a failure as such. And in this way, he may have actually deceived John Foster Dulles. This is kind of similar to the Bay of Pigs, where it turned out that the CIA actually never thought that there could be a popular uprising. They just wanted to use this as a way to put leverage on Kennedy to get him to intervene militarily. And it's also similar to the Gary Powers incident. As you'll see, this guy crashes from the sky and kind of messes up Eisenhower's peace conference later in Eisenhower's administration. We may talk about that again. But the whole thing fails eventually. The CIA operation fails.
All right. So, how and why then does the CIA's rebellion fail? And in talking about this, one parallel here that maybe listeners could keep in mind is Eugene Hassenfuss, or I don't know how to say his name, but the pilot who was shot down that sort of kicked off Iran Contra. Just keep them, rattling around in the back of your brain when we're talking about this.
Yeah, so Hassenfuss is a different case because I had never seen any kind of explanation that said that he was supposed to crash. Like, he was supposed to be the kicker on that plane for the Iran-Contra, and he actually gets shot down in a legitimate way. In the Indonesian case, the failure is a little different, but there is a Hassenfuss type character, as you'll see. A main actor here is this fellow Nasution, who's a high-ranking and loyal Indonesian military officer. Greg Polgrain had a number of conversations with him. And a turning point in this whole rebellion is in March of 1958, and he's able to capture this huge seizure of arms. And the way that he is able to do this is a U.S. military attaché to Indonesia is giving him hot information, okay? Cottrell, according to Nasution, Cottrell had prior knowledge of this arms drop in the early hours of March 12th, and he called him, this U.S. military attaché, Sterling Cottrell, calls Nasution 4 times on March 11th, and the 4th time is very urgent and anxious, and he's saying, send troops to this Pekanbaru airfield. So Nasution does this and puts these paratroopers on standby, and when they get reports of a 4-engine plane in the area, the paratroopers land on the airfield and capture this huge arms drop-off that had been put there by a Douglas DC-4. And it seems that Cottrell should have been in contact with the CIA channel that was at the U.S. Embassy, and then he passes this on. So this is sort of the CIA, probably Allen Dulles, undermining a CIA operation because it's being undermined as part of the actual plan. The KMT was a part of this operation. They were actually helping the rebels as well. And a couple months later, in May, you have the decisive moment of this, which is the capture of Alan Pope, who's a CIA pilot, and he is shot down reportedly, although it's a very strange thing, and captured by the Indonesians. And he had 30 documents with him, which is bad spycraft. You're not supposed to be carrying all these documents with you when you go around like this. It suggests that this was meant to be discovered. Initially, the whole story is very strange. It was supposedly one bullet that brought down the plane. The soldier testified to this effect, and Pope's testimony also. Other historians would later say it was anti-aircraft carrier, but they're kind of, to my understanding is they're basically making up the evidence for this, and that it just, because the original story that came out in court is kind of hard to believe. But there's not, but that's what the evidence says. So Pope said that the bullet hit the fuel tank, flames appear in the cockpit. He then ascends to 6,000 feet and then parachutes with his Indonesian co-pilot. As a result, a couple days later, U.S. support for this uprising officially ends. The U.S. had been denying they were involved here. The U.S. was saying, we're not involved in this conflict. This is an Indonesian thing. But then when Pope crashes with all these documents, they can no longer deny it. So was this the CIA scuttling it on purpose with using Pope to do this? It looks that way. One of the Indonesian officials said to Greg Polgrain, the Americans basically tricked us with this. The U.S. unofficially continued the support of the war, of the rebellion, but at a very low level, just to keep the sort of pressure on the military to further centralize. And here's a picture of Nasution later, which will be included in the notes here, of meeting with Robert Kennedy. Later, it's Robert Kennedy that actually negotiates the release of Alan Pope. The Kennedys took a different approach to Indonesia, which was abandoned, of course, tragically after Kennedy's assassination, which Sukarno believed was a result of his Indonesia policy. I wouldn't put that final point on it, but just to give you some spoilers here, that's what Sukarno comes to believe later.
Aaron, how did this fiasco of the Outer Islands Rebellion impact U.S.-Indonesia relations going forward? And again, we should always keep in mind, this is setting the stage eventually for one of the worst atrocities in 20th century history. The CIA said itself that the massacre in 65 and 66, in which 1 million to 3 million people were killed, leftists and communists were murdered. The CIA played a key role in that massacre. So clearly, the U.S. government is leaning very heavily against Sukarno. But the point is, at least internationally, how did this fiasco impact U.S. and Indonesia relations?
Well, I'll start off with this using a quote from the incomparable L. Fletcher Prouty, who was the Pentagon or the Pentagon's focal point officer coordinating the military support for CIA covert operations. So we knew a lot about CIA covert operations. He actually wrote an article on this whole episode in Indonesia, really one of the better articles that you could read in the 70s. I believe he wrote this in the later 70s. He wrote it in like a skin magazine because that's how it worked back then. It wasn't the internet, so you had to find publishers in strange places, and that's what he did. So this guy, L. Fletcher Prouty, who was involved in this, he's portrayed in JFK by Donald Sutherland, who's the X character. But he talked about Indonesia and this operation, and he said about it, it seemed the more the CIA failed, the more it grew and prospered. And so the CIA, from the CIA perspective, this is just an operation that's represents another line along the continuity of the growth and power of the clandestine state of the United States. For the U.S. long-term plans, it's an interesting quote from the Assistant Secretary for International Security Affairs, Mansfield Sprague, and he said, this is in March of 1958, as some of these operations are in their later stages. He said, in consideration of current U.S. military plans, there are no specific U.S. military requirements in Indonesia or West New Guinea. However, encroachments by the Sino-Soviet bloc would disrupt the United States policy on communist containment in the Far East and would partially isolate Australia. Domination of this area by the Sino-Soviet bloc would deny the United States and make available to China and the USSR certain rich national resources. This is a reference to the enormous wealth of West New Guinea, West Papua, that some of the people in the national security state are aware of, but that other key actors in Indonesia and the United States are unaware of, and they just obliquely refer to this as certain rich national resources. So this is important to understand in terms of what the U.S.'s plans are.